something beside me, a light to the kerosene, and the places aren't real anymore, and the faces don't say anything, in the silent light of the mind-blown sphere. It's a game, Devil's Chess Club. Devil's Chess Club.
Welcome to Devil's Chess Club. I'm Aaron Good. In this episode, Bryce, Greene, and I will be discussing a number of important and/or strange recent events, including the tenuously hopeful Gaza Genocide ceasefire, the LA fires, the new Russia-Iran strategic alliance, Peter Thiel's odd call for truth and reconciliation, and Alex Jones's new dubious JFK assassination story pointing to Lyndon Johnson. And also we'll be talking about our friend Sam Husseini, who, along with Max Blumenthal, gave world historic imperial gangster Tony Blinken a fitting send-off. Devil's Chess Club is part of the American Exception podcast. If you want to have access to what I hope is the best podcast collection of deep political and historical analysis, please subscribe to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. This includes our ongoing Gray Alliance series, which looks at the Lansky Syndicate, CIA, Mossad threads running through the JFK assassination, Watergate, and beyond. So if you appreciate this kind of research and analysis and are tired of Alex Jones and the other dubious conspiracism entrepreneurs, consider subscribing to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. The URL is patreon.com/American Exception. Either way, please kindly like this video and subscribe to this American Exception channel. Oh, Tenander, it's great to be back with you. Bryce Greene, it's great to be back with you.
It's good to be here, Aaron.
So we have been dealing with a whole lot of craziness here in 2025. It's been very eventful, and this is the year that we're wondering, is the world going to end this year? I wonder. Or what kind of crazy changes we have coming for us. They've recently announced a ceasefire deal in Palestine to supposedly halt the Gaza genocide. What has been the reaction? You're very active in Bloomington, Indiana University, the movement there for Palestine. What's the mood around there? Are people excited, or are people optimistic or pessimistic? How are people feeling?
So everyone here, was pretty relieved to have a ceasefire announced by both sides and officially agreed to, but we're pretty apprehensive about what it means in practice. The Israelis have been pretty clear that they're willing to sign a ceasefire deal and then continue to violate it. I mean, they've violated the ceasefire with Lebanon a 1,000 times already in the month that they've had that ceasefire going on. And also, it's the fact that even if the ceasefire is legitimate and Israel does a full pullout as they agreed to, you're still left with the blockade in Gaza, which was ongoing when we founded the Palestine Solidarity Committee before October 7th. And then you also have the fact that homes are destroyed. There's nothing to go back to. One of our friends, a student who came to IU from Gaza, he was just on the phone with his family, and they were talking about going back, and they were talking about how there's nothing to go back to, and so it's bittersweet. It's nice to see that maybe this is entering a new phase, but it's also certainly the occupation in it isn't ending, the apartheid isn't ending, the deaths that have been counted, they don't even touch the deaths that are ongoing and incoming as a result of things like malnutrition, lack of access to care, and chronic diseases that they don't have the means to treat and cure anymore. I mean, it's a pretty disastrous situation over there altogether. And there's a lot to say about the whole Trump of it all. One of the biggest unifying messages that you can see from everyone here is that so Biden didn't do anything this whole time, and even if the Trump putting pressure on them was a charade, I mean, but they could have done that the whole time.
Right.
Even if Trump is genuinely putting on pressure on them, or even if he's not, the Biden administration could have done something this whole time. All the reports from the Israeli press about how tough Trump is and how Trump is laying down the law, I don't know how to believe those. I tend to think that this is part of the big gift to Trump from Netanyahu. Back in October and November, it was reported pretty widely that Trump wanted the hostilities in Gaza to end before he came into office. And when the ceasefire in Lebanon happened, it was openly reported. The Israeli officials were telling the Washington Post that they did it as a gift to Trump. And so this is another gift to Trump that is able to make the Biden administration look bad, make Trump look good by comparison. But it also ends the war that Israel was well aware that it could not achieve its stated goals in, and was actually doing a number on the Israeli economy. I mean, you had massive exodus out of the country, big brain drain. You had the international embargo where all these countries were refusing to do trade with Israel, including some of their main energy suppliers. And as you and our listeners know, the energy situation in Israel drives a lot of their behavior. And so Israel had to end the war sometime, and doing it now gives them the opportunity to boost Trump and his anti-war credentials in the United States and set the stage for whatever other moves that Israel wants to do with Trump's backing.
Right. I'm going to show you something now that you've seen before, but I think this is a good and relevant thing here to add to this discussion. And I'm going to play Jeff Sachs and what Trump posted to his own Truth social media.
The war in Syria. And you may actually hear from grown-up reporters who are lying through their teeth or ignorant beyond imagining that, oh, the war in Syria, yes, Russia intervened in Syria. Well, do you know that that Obama tasked the CIA to overthrow the Syrian government, starting 4 years before Russia intervened? What kind of nonsense is that? And how many times did the New York Times report on Operation Timber Sycamore, which was the presidential order to the CIA to overthrow Bashar al-Assad? 3 times in 10 years. This is not democracy. This is a game. And it's a game of narrative. Why did the U.S. invade Iraq in 2003? Well, first of all, it was completely phony pretenses. It wasn't, oh, we were so wrong, they didn't have weapons of mass destruction. They actually did focus groups in the fall of 2002 to find out what would sell that war to the American people. Abe Schultzky, if you want to know the name of the PR genius. They did focus groups on the war. They wanted the war all the time. They had to figure out how to sell the war to the American people, how to scare the shit out of the American people. It was a phony war. Where did that war come from? You know what? It's quite surprising. That war came from Netanyahu, actually. You know that? It's weird. And the way it is that Netanyahu had from 1995 onward the theory that the only way we're going to get rid of Hamas and Hezbollah is by toppling the governments that support them. That's Iraq, Syria, and Iran. And the guy's nothing if not obsessive. And he's still trying to get us to fight Iran this day, this week. He's a deep, dark son of a bitch, sorry to tell you, because he's gotten us into endless wars, and because of the power of all of this in the U.S. politics, he's gotten his way. But that war was totally phony. So what is this democracy versus dictatorship? Come on. These are not even sensible terms.
So that is Trump posting a pretty damning critique from Sachs, which, to my mind, you know, I think that Sachs is basically correct, although he personifies Netanyahu as being the person behind this, when really, to me, it goes back to the beginning of Israel. There's always been a group I feel like the top of Zionism has always been, I mean, they never would declare their own borders. David Ben-Gurion was hell-bent on getting nuclear weapons, on killing Nasser, and so on. I mean, he's like considered some sort of golden age or George Washington, but he was kind of a lunatic. I mean, he resigned over the nuclear issue rather than like accept JFK's letter about how they would have to get rid of their or allow nuclear inspections or it could damage the U.S. relationship. And his own bodyguard was a guy named Joshua Cohen, who was the assassin of a great Swedish statesman who had been there on behalf of, I believe, the UN is how it worked, and was assassinated in 1948 by ultra-Zionist terrorists, like this guy. And Ben-Gurion made the guy his official bodyguard, a guy who just killed the diplomat because they thought, well, he was too much. He was too friendly to the Palestinians. He didn't want to give us as much as we wanted, so we're just going to assassinate him. That was back in 1948. So they've been doing that stuff. The terrorism of the Stern Gang and so on. I mean, they've just like that. That seems to be the apex of this whole thing. Like at the top, there's people who are going to murder people to get the absolute most that they can for Israel. They have a kind of Nazi mentality, really. And so when you say like, oh, it's Netanyahu, well, that's kind of maybe he's a synecdoche for the whole thing in a sense. Like he really has, and he has been since the 90s, the main guy. I mean, it was his people that killed Rabin, who was the last sort of vaguely liberal, potentially reformist person. And then he is connected to, Mark Rich and Scooter Libby and Wolfowitz and Feith, and all these people are from that same agenda, the clean break report that Sachs will talk about. So maybe this is Trump realizing that if this is going on, the Gaza genocide is going on under his presidency like it was under Biden's presidency, that it will really handicap him and make him a global pariah, that he has a way to get some soft, to help America's soft power from being destroyed so badly. And it's also not really helping Israel in the long run. But how do you stop this? Because Netanyahu has every incentive to keep these wars going forever for his own political survival. So maybe the optimistic reading would be that Trump is going to, is hoping for that this ceasefire is going to be a way to have some stability so that he's not immediately dealing with these crazy wars in his presidency. I tend to think he was Israel's pick. He was their preferred candidate, which is the scary thing. And so, is Netanyahu going to take one for the team? Is he going to be taken down and serve as a scapegoat to somehow absolve the U.S. and Israel of these things? Or what precisely is going to come out of this? What do you think of the prospects that Trump is, at least for his own, even if obviously for his own interests, but that he might recognize that his interests and the national interests coincide, and they are not more Gaza genocide? Do you think that's possible, or how likely?
Well, I know that Trump, like I said earlier, that Trump did not want to deal with this war. And to me, that does seem like an expression of this tendency that he's trying to embody with the rest of the Republican Party, putting themselves as the anti-war, friendly to the working class party. And there's some credibility to that, right? If Trump was the person to push Netanyahu to end the war, that's a serious positive development. Throughout the campaign, he was talking about how we need to end the war in Ukraine. Trump during his presidency. I just got done reading the book Trump and His Generals by Peter Bergen, and it's really just a story about how Trump's instincts were to be anti-war, to make a deal, to get the troops out of Syria, to get the troops out of Afghanistan, to engage with North Korea, to engage with Russia. I mean, these are all positive instincts that were pretty much beaten out of him throughout his administration. And I don't know if Trump has any coherent idea about what the national interest is, or what the challenges to the national interest are, other than sound bites and slogans. So I could easily see Trump seeing this, seeing Jeffrey Sachs talk about Syria, talk about Israel, and that will be great for my followers to see me tweet, and so he did it. But there were some of the cabinet picks that were kind of not not anti-imperialist by any stretch, but at least somewhat idiosyncratic. I'm thinking mostly of like Tulsi Gabbard, right? As the director of
And RFK. I mean, let's
and
honestly,
RFK.
I know his positions make no sense, but outside of the Israel stuff, what he said about about U.S. foreign policy was the more reasonable thing any presidential contender has said in a long time. But then, of course, he backs it up and just defiles it all by saying, "Oh, and I love Israel so much; and they're so righteous." So we know that, but even that, he's still something different.
It's definitely
in a
something
weird,
different.
totally incoherent way now.
I mean, it's stuff that you will never hear in a Democratic administration, almost certainly. And there are a lot of reasons for that. I mean, the closest you'll get is someone like Matt Duss, who is, a firm believer in almost everything America does, but just not to the extent that they do it. But even people like Tulsi Gabbard and RFK, I mean, they've shown that as you said, they're willing to subsume their own tendencies for the sake of the empire. I mean, Tulsi Gabbard just reneged on her opposition to the FISA 702 surveillance, which was the incidental data collection targeting all communications and all foreign communications between Americans and foreign people, scraping them all up. She said in a past life how awful that was. Well, now she seems to be okay with it. Just like Trump and Tulsi Gabbard were critical of the U.S. proxy war in Syria. Well, I mean, now that that proxy war is almost over, I mean, what does that mean for them? That the one of the few things that they did call out about American empire is now less of an issue than ever. One of the things that the Trump administration is doing is they seem to be on track, and I've heard people like Pepe Escobar and Scott Ritter talk about this, but they seem to be on track to do some sort of new Iran deal. Now, if that's true, then that means that there's a tension between them trying to do that and Israel's designs for, endless war and global domination and using Syria as a base to attack Iran. There might be some tensions there. And so these instincts that are embodied by Trump tweeting out these things, they might come into clash with the neocon establishment. But if Trump's last presidency is anything to go by, Trump will say, "Oh, well, looks like there's a lot of resistance to this policy, so I guess I'm just not going to do it." So I don't have that much optimism for what this means in practice.
Right. Yeah, I brace for the worst. I hope that it works out, that somehow things are positive. I mean, the more positive thing that I have heard from people, and there really isn't anybody that I feel like their analysis is like something I'm on board with 100% in some ways these days. So that's maybe a good sign that all these people are sort of thinking along slightly different lines. But I've heard, maybe it was Larry Wilkerson saying that perhaps Trump represents the retrenchment of empire and a sort of bowing to reality, that like there's enough people in high places and around Trump that are connected to reality. I mean, Trump has actually said more than other presidents, he's made some sober and kind of accurate statements about nuclear war and how we just have to avoid it, right? And I think that he may understand that. And RFK Jr. will speak about the need of that as well. And you wonder how much, he has. When I was with the RFK campaign, the super PAC, David and I were really trying to understand what we could do to potentially enlighten him about the Israel situation, right? I mean, not necessarily for just political reasons, but more like such a catastrophe and a moral thing, and he's losing his credibility, yada yada. And he was at one point, I talked about this on the previous podcast and stuff, because I was kept being told that we were going to I was running the podcast for them for a while, and there was this sit down discussion with Jeff Sachs and Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and we were told we could run it, but not until RFK finished his big like policy position paper on Israel, and he's been working on it so long, and it's going to be this great thing, right? And it just never came, and they never would let us air the discussion between Jeff Sachs and RFK Jr. But for whatever reason, he thought about airing it, and he was going to in conjunction with this paper. And so maybe, maybe for however much he has to kowtow to the lobby, maybe RFK recommended Sachs as someone that Trump should pay attention to on this issue or something like that. And that had something to do with this being posted because they were friends, RFK and Jeff Sachs. Jeff Sachs sort of endorsed RFK, gave him a soft endorsement, but he did pretty early on before he withdrew it, like most people did over Israel stuff, I mean, he gave up the ghost just like I gave up the ghost. And I mean, it was either going to be him or no pro-Palestine, pro-peace candidate, really. And so, but once it became clear, that was that. But maybe he has a little bit of sway there in his own crazy way. And maybe he's actually made arguments similar to what Sachs has made in the past, which is like actually what Israel's doing is probably hastening its demise on top of everything else. So I don't know that that's really anything substantive to hang our hopeful hat on, but there is that aspect of this. On the other hand, the $100 million from Adelson and the promise to let them annex the West Bank does not inspire confidence, nor does the possibility that Russiagate was really an Israeli thing to get Trump reelected. If the whole WikiLeaks, DNC leaks, Hillary email leaks, and all this may have been potentially an Israeli operation. If you read James Bamford and Moon of Alabama blog, there's a little bit on that. So there's that possibility. And it just seems like they wanted Trump. So when you think like, well, Trump and RFK were also clearly thralls to the Israel lobby, then well, that doesn't inspire confidence.
Yeah, and a lot of this stuff that Sachs is talking about the global world order, the new Cold War era that we find ourselves in. A lot of it, most of it, has to do with China, with global competition between the U.S. and China. And if Trump is listening to Sachs and listening to people like Sachs about that, it seems that he's ignoring it because most of what Trump's foreign policy is oriented around is this new Cold War. You saw the hubbub made about Greenland and Panama, right? It wasn't discussed much at the time, but you look at what the empire thinks about how to boost itself in preparation for the war against China. Well, Greenland and Panama have a lot to do with that. In Greenland, that overextending and unbalancing Russia paper, it talked about increasing U.S. military operations in the Arctic around Greenland in order to ensure that Russia now has to respond to that, thus overextending itself further, which means that it will be less of a boon to China when the eventual big war comes. And Panama was the same way. It should be obvious, major trade intersection. If you want to blockade China and you realize that China's naval capacity is mainly defensive, which they do acknowledge, well, then you have to blockade China from far away, from other parts in the world. And if you can get the Panama Canal under your control, well, then you've cut off China or you've increased the cost dramatically to China of these imports. So both Greenland and China have their own role within this new Cold War. And Trump, it seems that someone whispered in his ear talking about these strategic locations, and then he took it and ran with it in typical Trump fashion. So if there is an anti-empire, pro-détente inkling with somewhere in that administration, it seems to be being drowned out in areas regarding China.
Yeah. I would say this. The U.S. had the Monroe Doctrine, from the Monroe presidency, which was around 1820, right? The era of good feelings, James Monroe. And that was a time when the U.S. was saying that it would not accept any further colonization in the Western Hemisphere. So they would not allow any more European empires to expand their holdings in the Western Hemisphere, and that it would not meddle in European affairs. It also said, okay, and so they've kept the Monroe Doctrine around as a philosophy, as though it's like, the Western Hemisphere, Latin America is our backyard, and you're not allowed to come over in our backyard. And then you have the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which is the early in the Roosevelt's presidency after McKinley was assassinated, and he became the president. And that said that the U.S. could basically go down and act as a policeman, whenever it needed to in its own backyard. It's like, it's a corollary. We're going to add on a little bit to the Monroe Doctrine. Like, not only can you guys can the Europeans not colonize over here, we can also invade any country anytime we want to. So it's one way to interpret this, because everything he's talking about here, the craziest shit he's talking about is stuff in the Western Hemisphere. The Greenland, of course, which is in the north, but it's in the Western Hemisphere, obviously, and then the Panama Canal, and then he's made noises about Mexico and mass deportations or invasions even at some point. And you had Brett Stevens, right? The basically, overall criminal individual who writes at the New York Times and advocates for illegal, massive crimes against humanity, is at it again, and he was calling for invading Venezuela. Right, which should probably be he should probably be jailed for that if we lived in a lawful country. Like,
yeah,
it's crazy. If you think about it, you can't like say like, kill Pete Smith or whatever. I'm sorry for the Pete Smiths out there in the world, but you can't say that hypothetically. You can't say something like that because it's incitement, right?
I can't write an article telling people to go out and shoot all the CEOs of all the healthcare companies. That's like illegal. That's incitement to violence.
Yeah, that would be so. This is, but yet you can say this, but that just kind of shows you like you can't be a little gangster, but it's okay to be a big gangster or to be a PR flack for big gangsters, which is what Brett Stevens is. But these are all they're all in the Western Hemisphere, these spots, and it does seem to be a kind of rational reaction for the in the evil rationale of the empire that. With the defeat in Ukraine coming, which we'll talk about in a second, they're going to be needing to retrench. I mean, Europe, I think, is falling apart. The EU and NATO are falling apart. They are the fall. It looks like NATO. I think that NATO. I agree with people that say that NATO would seem to be on a trajectory of ending, because it just makes no sense for Europe to hitch its wagon to the U.S. when the U.S. can't. This relationship cannot guarantee prosperity anymore. They're being evicted from West Africa, the French most notably, and they have suffered enormously. German industry has, and other countries that have had to pay a little bit more for gas because of different workarounds that had to come to get Russian gas, and now they're cutting that off. It's just you have Romania, which they just canceled elections because they didn't like the results. You had assassination attempts in Slovenia? Was it Slovenia or Slovakia?
I think it was Slovenia.
Okay, yeah.
But now that you raised the question, now I'm not sure.
No, it's messing with me too. And then in Germany, it looks like Alternative for Deutschland is going to win.
With the support of American oligarch Elon Musk.
Right. So Elon Musk seems to. It seems that there are Trump people who are enthusiastic about getting rid of NATO, and you wonder what their game is in that way. Some people are saying that they plan to just sort of loot Europe, like the IMF comes in and they mess up other countries, or they're hoping for a brain drain where all the best engineers and stuff will come to the U.S. But I just don't understand why they don't partner with Russia. I mean, Russia and China, with Russia's resources and the European. Technology, better education systems, more advanced systems, they could be prosperous and not part of the U.S. orbit anymore.
Yeah. I mean, the U.S. can sabotage their infrastructure, blow up the Nord Stream. They can push this war on Europe that it's very clear that the Europeans didn't really want. Like, Macron and, the Germans, they were trying to actually negotiate. It's very obvious that they're getting the short end of the stick with their relationship with the United States. The only reason that they seem to be operating this way is because they're politically captured. And I've been meaning to ask you if you had, or I guess the audience in general, if they had a book recommendation on the American capture of European political systems that includes things like Gladio for the better part of the Cold War, and includes things like just the deep politics of the corporate capture, the American corporate capture of the European system, because it's not rational what they're doing. It's not normal for a country to look at a next door neighbor that has massive energy resources, then to reject them in favor of a big bully down the street that costs a lot more money to get stuff from. That's not rational. So what is the process behind that? Like, what? Why?
Yeah, well, this is, of course, going to sound self-serving, but I think that within my book, there's a better explanation, because I drew from, in doing a bunch of research, I found two people in particular, one of them just by luck, because I won't say by luck, because his interests are so similar to mine. But let me start with the first one, which is Cardwell. This guy named Cardwell, who wrote a book called NSC68 and the Political Economy of the Early Cold War. And I think his name was Kurt Cardwell, and he died really young, unfortunately, like in his 40s, and he'd just written this book and then dies a few years later. But the book was something that I found because I kind of had this suspicion along similar lines about why NATO and Europe were functioning the way they were vis-a-vis the U.S., and he wrote a book on the subject, really. And the deal was that during the Cold War, or as the Cold War is breaking out, they realized that Russia really isn't going to, Soviets aren't going to invade. They're not going to send tanks over and try to make the whole Europe communist. And so therefore, the tendency would be similar to now, because they know Putin doesn't want to invade, really. They know Putin doesn't want to take over Germany and France, right? But the issue is the same then as it is today. They cannot handle European economic integration, and which would follow a sort of political integration in some sort of ways. They cannot have Russia integrated into quote the West. And so when these planners at the early parts of the Cold War were looking at the situation, they were saying the real risk is neutrality, European neutrality. That if they are neutral, they will just, left to their own devices, they'll start trading with Russia with all that cheap energy, grain, whatever, the minerals, other resources. Because Russia has so many of them that this would be the tendency, and this would mess up their plans for the grand dollar area of the world. And so for that reason, they ramp up the Cold War. They start beefing up efforts to roll back communism and so on. So that's part of it. Kurt Cardwell's book, NSC68 and the Political Economy of the Early Cold War. And the other really illuminating thing was from Ola Tenander, who was at the Peace Research Institute in Oslo. And over the course of his career, because he was in peace studies, and he studied international security, he met a lot of people like Bill Colby, James Schlesinger, other high-ranking NATO officials and Swedish officials. And in Sweden, which wasn't even a NATO country, he found that from talking to people that, including, I think, it may have been Colby who told him this, or it may have been Schlesinger, it may have been one of these other generals, but basically the rule for NATO with Sweden was nothing on paper. So because Sweden wasn't a NATO country, these arrangements had to be kept secret, but that NATO had stay-behinds in Sweden. So when you think about the assassination of Olof Palme in 1986, think about that. And the stay-behinds, of course, are these Gladio units that are there as like sort of terrorism. They're supposed to be there in case there's a Soviet invasion, but they're really just a right-wing, plausibly deniable terrorist entity that can stage terrorist attacks that you can blame on communists in order to move people politically to the right and more on the anti-communist side. So there's there's economic imperatives of keeping Europe on side. And that goes back to the same logic of the early Cold War. You don't want them trading with Russia. And there's a top-down system wherein basically the NATO is the sovereign of Europe. Like if these countries do something and statesmen do something that the U.S. doesn't like, that threatens the alliance and threatens U.S. hegemony, they can be killed. And this has happened to a number of leaders, a number of statesmen, a number of European statesmen have been killed by the U.S. I'm thinking of Dag Hammarskjöld, thinking of Olof Palme, Thankfully, Ola Tenander's still alive. And I hope he's around for a good long time. He's a great guy. But they killed Olaf Palme. Alfred Herrhausen seems that way to be one of those cases. Aldo Moro. Who even knows who else? And those things serve as examples. I mean, as I was talking about Ben Gurion earlier, Ben Gurion makes Yashua Cohen his bodyguard, right? And then in the 60s, it's at some event, Ben Gurion is like seated next to Dag Hammarskjöld, who's this Swedish statesman, and Yashua Cohen is there as well. And so, Dag Hammarskjöld is sitting right next to this guy who assassinated a great Swedish statesman and is now sitting next to the head of this new state called Israel. I mean, this is the West. They're just brazen. And I mean, what's more brazen than having a guy who is known to have assassinated a liberal statesman?
I mean, it's like literally pulling out a gun and putting it on the table in front of you and saying, like, this is what I have.
Yes. And it's so the long and the short of it is that NATO is sovereign over, NATO countries and even Scandinavian countries that weren't officially part of NATO for decades. And really, NATO is run by the U.S. So the U.S. is like this globo-sovereign. And it's in Ola Tenander's essays, some of them, he basically says the only analogy he can compare it to is the German Reich, and the plans for the German Reich is like where you have this sovereign whose word is unchallengeable, who runs this empire. And that's like the U.S. Then the liberal rules-based order really is an American Führer principle. It's basically like liberal rules. Well, who makes these rules? Well, the U.S. makes the rules. Who enforces them? No, the U.S. enforces them. Well, who's allowed to break them at their whim? That would be the U.S. too. But that's the world order that the U.S. has created and is trying to police and maintain. So that's some weighty shit.
Right.
I want to change tack here, or actually go back to this last part I want to say about what's been happening in Gaza, things related to the Gaza genocide. And we have our friend Sam Husseini and Max Blumenthal, a video of these two people at Blinken's last press conference. Blinken, Secretary of State, really horrendous fellow. But here's a report on this and some footage of what happened, which I think will be one of the more lasting moments from the spectacle of the Biden administration.
300 reporters in Gaza were on the receiving end of your bombs. Why did you keep the bombs flowing when we had a deal in May? We all knew we had a deal. Everyone in this room knows we had a deal, Tony, and you kept the bombs flowing. Why did you sacrifice the rules-based order on the mantle of your commitment to Zionism? Why did you allow my friends to be massacred? Why did you allow my friends' homes in Gaza to be destroyed when we had a deal in May? You helped destroy our religion, Judaism, by associating it with fascism. You waved the white flag before Netanyahu. You waved the white flag before Israeli fascism. Your father-in-law was an Israel lobbyist. Your grandfather was an Israel lobbyist. Are you compromised by Israel? Why did you allow the Holocaust of our time to happen? How does it feel to have your legacy be genocide? You too, Matt. You smirked through the whole thing every day. You smirked through a genocide.
Get your hands off me. 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 Answer a question. Do you know about the Hannibal Directive? Do you know about Israel's nuclear weapons? Everybody from the ICJ. I was sitting here quietly, and now I'm being manhandled by 2 or 3 people. You pontificate about a free press. You pontificate about a free press. You are hurting me. You are hurting me. You are hurting me. I'm asking questions after being told by Matt Miller that he will not answer my questions until I ask him questions. Wasn't the point of the May 31st statement to block the ICJ orders? You blocked the ICJ orders.
Please, sir, respect the process.
Oh, respect the process. Respect the process. While everybody from Amnesty International. From Amnesty International to the ICJ saying that Israel is doing genocide and extermination, and you're telling me to respect the process. Criminal! Why aren't you in The Hague? Why aren't you in The Hague? Why aren't you in The Hague?
Bryce, what do you make of these two gentlemen? Sam is a great guy, a courageous guy. I've spoken to Max before, and I'm familiar with his work on Israel-Palestine, which I think is very good. But Blinken and this whole thing, what is this? What is the legacy here, and what can we take from this as far as these guys as models, at least of producing some kind of positive spectacle? I mean,
Right.
How should we think of this?
Yeah, like Max and Sam. I mean, they both do a lot of good work, and they've both been very critical of the Biden administration. When they go to these State Department briefings, they're usually the only people asking serious questions, except maybe that AP old guy sometimes. But
Matt something, right?
Yeah, and he's pretty easily subdued. But I mean, this was the last time that Blinken would get on that podium and spin his bullshit to the American public. And both Sam and Max, I think they did a good job by not sitting idly by and letting that go unnoticed. I mean, what's remarkable is the rest of the people in that room. They've been there, I mean, more often, sometimes for years longer than Sam or Max has. And they've been lapping up this administration's nonsense, every administration's nonsense, really, for their entire careers. And very rarely do you have anyone dissent publicly against it. And even rarer still are people who refuse to shut up while Blinken is doing his genocide defending empire apologia up there. And so I'm glad they did what they did. I'm glad that the image of Blinken around the world is being tarnished by having a bunch of armed goons drag an old man out of his chair and out of the room just because he's speaking pretty obvious and understood truths. So I think this was a good event. I checked in with Sam after this. I mean, he's a friend. And I was just making sure he wasn't hurt or anything, and glad to know that he is okay and he was not arrested. He wasn't detained by the officer. I guess this is Capitol Police or something. But he's still strong, and both of them, I assume, are going to continue doing great work in this new Trump administration.
Yeah, I mean, they are guys who have been pretty steadfast in their support for Palestine and their opposition to Zionism. And so, I take my hat off to them for giving us a positive spectacle to pour over. And for the history books, I think this will be remembered. And I think that this is a good sort of snapshot of, America's liberal institutions. I want to talk a moment about Russia and the situation with Ukraine and so on. We've already been speaking a little bit about NATO, so we don't need to go very long on this. But there was today, on the 17th, Russia and Iran's leadership have been meeting, and they have agreed to a broader strategic partnership. My understanding is that it does not include a mutual defense, aspect to it, like a treaty for mutual defense, meaning that if one was attacked, the other would be obligated to come to its defense. But it does call for even greater cooperation in all areas, including, military, and it has there's more economic integration and so on, and help each other diplomatically. So this seems to indicate Russia and Iran are closer, and that we could expect Russia to put some energy into helping support Iran to be able to defend itself. I think Russia and China both really benefit from having Iran not being destroyed by the West. So this is in a lot of people's interests. The Ukrainian situation seems to be deteriorating. That'll probably end this year. At that point, Russia will have this huge military production capacity that could be retooled for and used to help other countries like Iran, if they were to enter into a bigger military alliance, to be basically unassailable by Western powers. So are you disappointed that there's not a mutual defense aspect to this? Because I have to say that I am, because I feel that would have made it impossible to attack Iran rationally, although the people we're talking about are not rational. So maybe Russia has a more far-seeing plan than I do. But what is your take on this?
I mean, the lack of a mutual defense pact makes sense in the sense that both of these powers have been striving for like flexibility on their end. I mean, look at how Russia handled Syria. Imagine if there was a mutual defense pact between Assad and Putin. Well, that would have meant that this whole HTS business would have dragged Putin into a disaster that he might not have been able to do while simultaneously advancing in Ukraine. Uh, the reason that they pulled out and they were able to leave Assad essentially to his fate while extracting the man and his family out was because they made the calculation that the fall of Syria, so to speak, would be a Western victory, but it wouldn't be a strategic defeat for Russia because they weren't bogged down in it. And that again, that overextending and unbalancing Russia paper from the Rand Corporation talked about how doing something in Syria could draw Russia in, and Russia didn't fall for that trap. Doing something that would guarantee that Russia would be pulled in a Western attack on Iran. Again, that wouldn't serve Russia's interest. It might a defense pact might deter such action, but it also might encourage such action in the same way that they deliberately try to overextend and unbalance Russia by going after Iran. The lack of this defense pact seems to allow both sides to have greater flexibility.
Yeah, I mean, that's one way to think about it, and that may be what they are thinking. And it also may be a way for Russia to exert more pressure on Iran not to destabilize things with a big counterattack, perhaps, because we've heard that they may have an attack in the offing after the last breach of Iranian airspace and attacks, which weren't successful, but nevertheless would justify a response from Iran. So maybe this gives Russia a little bit of leverage in this. And it can also give Iran a reason to say to its population that, well, we have to be careful. We don't necessarily have Russia here. So people in Iran who might want to calm things down and avoid, a bigger conflict, maybe they would even have a reason to support this at the same time that we might not quite understand.
All right, Iran's position is they're definitely in a position where they don't want to bring the wrath of America and Israel on them without any good reason. Because with Iran and with Russia and with China, with the entire multipolar world, time is on their side.
Yeah,
right.
Absolutely.
If they do nothing and watch the West tear itself apart through stupid military intervention after stupid tax cut after failed industrial policy, then they win. Yeah. And so if they want to attack, if they wanted to launch, True Promise 3, well, then that would open up Israel to do what Israel always wants to do. And Iran doesn't want to get blown up by nuclear weapons. And so there's a very good reason for them to exercise some sort of restraint, even if, I mean, by a 6-year-old's reading of international law, they would be totally justified in launching a full-scale attack on Israel, if not the United States.
I mean, every country has signed, treaties. Most countries have, the Genocide Convention and so on. They're supposed to stop genocide.
Right.
So I think basically any attack on Israel is justified on that basis. But of course, it's supposed to go through certain channels and so on. But anyway, it's this, as you say, the inertia of history and imperial collapse is such that they just need to avoid catastrophe. So I do understand that the non-Western world needs to avoid any kind of catastrophic conflict, which would seem to be the only thing that could save the white man's empire. Speaking of which, there's a lot of sad people in LA, and some of them are very wealthy people, and it might be a little more difficult to feel sad for the rich people who've had their extravagant homes burned down. But there's a lot of other people there that have suffered enormously because of this, who aren't part of our little oligarch class. And God, what a catastrophe this is. It's just, to my mind, what this says is that it points again to the total lack of responsibility and statesmanship in the regime that we have. Why have we spent so much money fighting wars in Iraq and, giving money to Al Qaeda so they could fight for us in Syria, and fighting the war in Ukraine, which has been this huge waste, and giving so much money to Israel, when we don't spend money on things like R&D to deal with issues like global warming? I mean, even ways to compensate with the consequences, not even to reverse global warming, but to deal with the consequences, like the fact that the weather's more volatile. You could get different, more unstable weather patterns. It might be my understanding is that you had a wet 2 years in a row that were really wet and it grew a lot of vegetation, and then a really dry year which turned all that vegetation to kindling, and that was why it was so ready for this kind of fire, and that their reservoirs were drained and less than they should have been, and that California devotes too much water to agriculture. The nut farms like pistachios and such, pomegranates and all that, owned by this Resnick family that owns like more than half of the water of California, something insane like that. These billionaire oligarchs, because of our insane system, And like, why haven't we spent billions of dollars researching, renewable clean energy? Some sort of, like Chinese are further along on fusion than we are, as I understand it. If I'm not 100% sure if that's true or not, but desalinization technology, so that you would have enough water on hand to fight something like this. We've been so irresponsible and stupid about these things, because we're run by a bunch of people who are just trying to keep their empire going and get more billions of dollars. And so there's no real responsible authority at the top. And this is just another case where we're like, oh yeah, we should have done these things. And it's pretty obvious. You can explain it just like I explained it, pretty simply. And yet you can't do it, because you can only do things that don't interfere with some billionaire's racket. And the billionaires have basically gobbled up every area of society that politics would want to be active in. So, I mean, what is your takeaway from the horrors that we've seen out there?
Yeah, I mean, like, the theme of my adult life in politics so far is just a government's failure to protect its people, and a different set of interests from its people. This is a pretty wealthy state, relatively speaking, but even they are, and they're Democrat run. But I mean, this goes to show you how it's just a single party, a single set of neoliberal policies that are governing their ideology. I mean, you could have a federal jobs program, a state jobs program to get a bunch of firefighters and to build all this infrastructure, pay scientists and pay land survey people to give you the list of best practices to prevent something like this from happening. But they didn't do that. And of course, with climate change looming, these fires are going to be more and more likely and more intense. For every degree of warming past pre-industrial levels, the studies are rough, but they say that the number of land that's affected by fires will increase fourfold. And so, like, for every degree, 3 degrees warming, that's what's 16 times 4? Not doing that, but that's a massive increase in the amount of fires. So the fact that they are ignoring this looming threat in favor of, not doing that, in favor of spending money destroying public infrastructure and ignoring the needs of actual people, I mean, this was bound to happen. And in fact, you've seen that Joe Rogan clip going around, right, of him saying that he was talking to a firefighter, and, firefighters everywhere are saying, like, yeah, one day there'll just be a fire that'll rip through LA and there's nothing we can do to stop it. It's been common knowledge for quite some time that LA and a lot of other areas in California are at risk of just down wires being sparked, or an extended period of drought, heat, setting fire to all this vegetation. I mean, it's a known thing, but they refuse to do anything to address it. Now, there are some people who think that the fires were intentionally started. There was a lot of theories about, the water pressure was deliberately lowered. I mean, the water pressure thing, I mean, that's just because there was a fire going on and they had to fight a lot of fires. And the investigations into arson are pretty common when it comes to these sorts of fires, but it's very easy to see how, disaster capitalism can rear its ugly head. You don't need an intentional spark for this when it's almost inevitable that it would happen regardless. But the people who are going to cash in on this are going to be the developers who get to buy up all this land and do something with it. And maybe it won't be profitable because it's uninsurable. Who knows? But either way, getting cheap land has been an agenda of America's oligarchs for quite some time. We've seen it with the Bill Gates buying up agriculture. We've seen it with BlackRock and all these State Street and Vanguard, all them buying up homes to just have and hoard. Again, the end result of this disaster will be disaster capitalism, which will be another transfer of wealth from normal people to the ultra rich. And even though a bunch of these houses that burned down were, wealthy in some of the wealthiest neighborhoods, a lot of them weren't. The Altadena neighborhood, it's one of the largest black suburbs in Los Angeles, was devastated by this. And I'd be surprised if there weren't a bunch of developers circling around that area like vultures right now.
Yeah, they'll have to come up with some solution to have, functional firefighting, but it is
functional firefighting that isn't prisoners, that isn't prison labor.
We have disaster capitalism, and you could really say the U.S. society is a capitalist disaster. So there you go. So let's talk about TikTok here. I'm not an expert on this, and I was banned from TikTok before I ever posted anything. So
you were banned
there. Yeah, I am banned. I
Interesting.
tried to create an account, and they're like, no, you can't do that. You're banned. And I was, well, why am I banned? And then I couldn't figure it out. But I have to guess it's probably the U.S. It wasn't China that banned me, because I've published they've had me write for Global Times, a Chinese newspaper. I always turned down money because I didn't want people to say you're getting paid by China. China. People are saying, so I was like, well, no, I'll write for you, but I'll write for you for free. But this TikTok business, there's more and more noise made about how Trump may actually issue an executive order to stop this, which would make him very popular, because it's an unpopular thing. TikTok is popular. And the other consequence of the impending TikTok ban is a bunch of people have gone on Red Note, which is a similar app that does similar things to TikTok, and it's even more fully Chinese than the TikTok in the U.S., which is basically complying to U.S. regulations and so on, and licensing issues. The U.S. TikTok in the U.S. already has a bunch of spooks working there, and ex-spooks, X in quotation marks, who are there to serve different functions that allow the U.S. to control and censor, basically manipulate content. But I think the issue is that because it's Chinese, they can't just go in and say, okay, let us have the algorithm, and you're not going to know what it is. Like, they can't do what Twitter and Facebook do, which basically manipulates politics and makes it so that only certain kinds of people see certain kinds of posts, and like other people are sort of quarantined from them, so that like a condom of so information doesn't penetrate them or something. And they can't TikTok. They can't do that. So I think that's really the issue, because I've read articles about how many spooks and stuff are already working in TikTok.
Alan McLeod at MinPress has been doing all these investigations using just public data to show all these FBI, NSA, CIA people at TikTok.
Yeah. The problem is that the things that they don't like, which is people saying their opinions or posting accurate information about things that have happened, especially in Palestine, that they don't have any legitimate basis for censoring them or algorithmically deboosting them or hiding them, shadow banning them. They just don't have the basis for that, and that's why they're like, oh, TikTok's a big problem. It's a big problem. And it's a big problem because the truth is a big problem for these people. They actually, for all they say about the free press and freedom and we're protecting the free world, they are brazen liars and criminals, as we know, and they don't believe in free speech at all. They believe in creating institutions of free speech, quote unquote, when those institutions create a sort of openness that allows anyone with enough money to enter the free speech space and make as much noise as they want with their propaganda. That's why they are always saying, we like free speech, we like open society, and so on. We like liberal democracy. We like the marketplace of ideas. but they like the marketplace of ideas as much as they like any other marketplace. And the thing that any marketplace has to have for them is the ability to be rigged and work out to their benefit. Once it doesn't work out to their benefit, then they just want to rig the marketplace of ideas because they're brazen hypocrites as well. And so this is a very funny scene. And if Trump does reverse the TikTok ban, I will have a good laugh at the Democrats who just made themselves look like idiots to serve the Israel lobby. And they just come across seeming like, I mean, they're the ones who are the despots. They're the ones who are not in favor of ideas being circulated.
Right. I think today, was it, the Supreme Court upholded the TikTok ban, which means that the government now has the authority to ban any app that's not American for, I mean, they have to give a reason, but, I mean, you have to give a reason for doing everything you do. It's completely arbitrary. So, I mean, under this law, let's say Red Note gets a lot more popular, they could ban Red Note. But, build a 10-foot wall. Maybe there'll be a bunch of 12-foot ladders coming on. They were pretty transparent about why they're banning TikTok. Yeah. They said that, we can't control what's on it. That's dangerous. And the American tech oligarchs are pretty transparent about why they support it. Because, every time someone is using TikTok, they're not using Facebook or Instagram or YouTube or these other American apps that are taking our attention. And so it doesn't seem like the only reason that the Trump administration would try and stay this ban, again, is a PR victory. But even if he does do that, the ability to ban these apps is still there. So every little bit towards a full-on authoritarianism needs to be taken into account. Every statute that gets arbitrarily extended, or every time the state of emergency gets extended. I mean, this is a step on towards a future that many Americans don't want to be a part of. Most people don't want to live in a despotism where the state is telling you, hey, you can't do this, you can't say this. And ironically, I have a lot of positive things to say about China, but they're openly censorious. They censor Red Note, but I don't really have a problem with the fact that I can't criticize the Chinese government on Red Note, because I'm an American and my business is here. But each of these platforms represents a new space where Americans can be exposed to different kinds of information. And they call it the TikTok refugees going to Red Note. You're seeing all these sorts of videos of people learning that, the social credit system that I learned about here in the United States was fake. The Uyghur
the Chinese
genocide
social credit system.
Yeah, the Chinese social credit system is fake. The Uyghur genocide is fake. They're learning. In fact, I think it was also this morning, or maybe it was last night, the Chinese foreign minister, was it? I don't remember, but a Chinese official made a comment about this, saying, this is pretty positive. It's a positive development to have this massive cultural exchange going on between these populations. And, I'm fully in favor of that. I posted a picture of my cat on Red Note, and then a bunch of, Chinese accounts were like, oh, that's so cute. That's nice. So building bridges where we can.
Yeah. My experience with Chinese people and Taiwanese people as well, so this could be, overall Chinese culture, but on the mainland, I guess that's the more relevant one to look at here. People were very friendly to me as an American, even though I know my country's own history of antagonism towards them and so on. I found people, I think that more of these kind of cross-cultural exchanges would be a positive thing, because people would, it would dispel some of the stereotypes about China, which are rather incoherent and stupid at this point. China has changed so much that even the last 20 years, very different population. They seem more like the Taiwanese than the Chinese people of 20 years ago or so. The younger students, because I've been at a boarding school for a while, you see the students come and go, and the change from the Chinese nationals here, in the beginning when I came at this school, which was in the early aughts, you had a real marked difference between the people from the mainland and the people from Taiwan. The people from Taiwan seem much more Americanized or Westernized, for lack of a better word. And then now the Chinese students seem about as comfortable in the West as the Taiwanese students did back then. They don't seem so out of place, and there's much more of these basically English proficient, culturally adept Chinese students. And I have to guess that this just reflects changes in Chinese society due to this great economic development and the sort of political changes in China over decades and decades, which have given them a regime that serves the interest of the people much more than the American one does, and that's why they've seen improvement in all of these quality of life indicators and development indicators. Whereas in the U.S., they passed the U.S. in life expectancy. That is such a damning indictment of the ineptitude and the greed and brutality, and really it points to the criminality of this regime that we live under, because we're told that we're number one and we have a divine right to rule the world. But then when you look at all these indicators about how healthy our society is, it just gets worse and worse. And everybody knows that the current political actors are not going to make it any better. So maybe more discussions of if people on China are talking to Americans and they're saying, yeah, well, things have gotten better in this area. We have this and we have this. We used to not have this, but now we do and do. And Americans are more thinking, well, everything gets more expensive, more unattainable, and more difficult, and the future seems more and more hopeless. Then it might be good for them to see that, hey, you actually, governments and planning and politics actually could make life better for people.
Right. Well, one question that I think will tell you a lot about your society is whether or not you believe your children will have a better life than you. And if you're a Chinese person, the answer is very obviously, yeah. Yes, they are. My grandparents were living in, total poverty. And now I'm living in a fully industrialized world. And, the grandparents are alive to see it. And my grandkids are probably going to be flying around in hydrogen-powered flying cars, But in America, you say your grandparents, they were able to buy a house while working at Dairy Queen. Meanwhile, if you're working at Dairy Queen, you're probably going to die of malnutrition. And your kids are probably going to be working for nothing. And that's the trend. And there doesn't seem to be any path that Americans can reasonably chart out in their minds to actually improve their conditions. I was just looking at I think it was Ben Norton who posted the polling numbers for, I'm blanking on her name, but the new Mexican president. She's
Shine
very
Bomb
popular.
Or something like that.
Yeah.
I can't remember her name, but yeah, she seems to be in the mold of AMLO.
Yeah, and AMLO and Lula and a pink tide
She's like
type
80%,
government.
80% approval.
80% approval rate. Could you imagine the American system being able to produce a leader with a legitimate plan for change and the genuine mandate of the public, a super majority of people supporting them? No, you can't imagine that. The closest thing we've got to that was Bernie Sanders, and Bernie Sanders, they screwed him. But even if he was the president, there's no plausible path for change. Even if he was the president of the United States, the Congress, where most of the power lies, would have just said, screw off. And you could have done a lot, but you couldn't permanently change the direction of your country.
He might have been in some ways. He might have been able to disclose some state secrets that would be quite explosive if he was of the mind to do that. But
right. And we're assuming that he wanted to do it.
But also, he could have had, if he'd run as president, he could have had real coattails in Congress. He could have. It could have been a different thing, which is why they did everything to stop him.
Right.
When you're saying he couldn't do anything, well, he was enough of a threat for them to move heaven and earth. And this time to not even have a primary because they're so afraid of such a thing. They didn't even. They just basically selected someone that nobody voted for and said, "This is your candidate. Enjoy it."
Yeah, but even in the Congress, it would take an overwhelming amount of power to actually get people on the committees that would let the things go through that you want, and because the people who run the committees are controlled by the two oligarchic parties. And if the party doesn't like you, let's say AOC was like the radical communist that everyone believed that she was. Well, they could have just sidelined her and said, "Hey, you're not getting any committee assignments. What you get is your vote on these bills and nothing else." Well, then that's the ballgame. You'd have to have a genuine movement, a genuine political movement that's able to elect a whole wave of different Congress people, and then have an agenda that they want to move on. There's so many blocks in the American political system where an oligarch can just intervene and stop that from happening. In the Mexican political system, they have a massive oligarchy. They have a lot of political problems, but the institutions that form the base of their social life and their social political life, they're able to coalesce and make big change in the country. We don't have that here.
Well, Mexico has been mostly a one-party state for a lot of its existence. So it's like and yet, as you say, they are able to have a government like this one, which is unthinkable in the U.S. The U.S. has an ultimately anti-democratic regime. The regime is all of those institutions that control who controls the state. And ours, as we saw with Bernie, is anti-democratic ultimately. It will take the most democratic, with a lowercase d, candidate and see them as a threat, and then move heaven and earth to make it so that they cannot gain control of the state. And this is how it functions. And if that doesn't work, they can kill the presidents if need be, and that's just the kind of system that we have. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this next one because we've gone on for a bit here, and I still have one more thing after this. But I don't know if you saw this or not.
I didn't see this.
This is how weird things are getting. Peter Thiel, PayPal mafia, oligarch, right-wing, fanatic, capitalist, fetishist, really. He wrote an article in the Financial Times, A Time for Truth and Reconciliation. Trump's return to the White House augurs the apocalypse of the ancien regime's secrets. This is a dumb article if you read it, especially he goes in and talks about 1619 at some point. His politics are weird, but then
wait, what does 1619 have to do with truth and?
He's basically saying that there's too many people today who are wanting to talk about controversial things in the past that we're never going to figure out, like the true meaning of 1619. He says something to that effect. So I think he's basically trying to dunk on the wokesters,
Yeah.
Whatever. 1619 is an annoying liberal thing to me. That's not very
not
radical. It's really basically like 1619. Everything is about race and how if white people weren't racist, this whole country would be different. But it's built on racism. It's like a way to let capitalism off the hook. Basically, it's like that kind of analysis. So it's like this. What was the slave trade really? Well, 1619 is a slave trade, but the slave trade wasn't. It's like people said, let's get some slaves because we need some way. We need some way for us to be able to celebrate our hatred of black people. So why don't we just create this institution of slavery? That's not what it really was about. The whole cosmology of white supremacy and racism was founded upon the material benefits that came from this slave trade and slave economy, and that's what 1619 is supposed to make.
This is a bit of a tangent, but the guy Ibram X. Kendi.
Oh God, yes.
Yeah, he wrote the book. He wrote a book stamped from the beginning, like the history of racist ideas, and it's not horrible. And he talks about this exact phenomenon that you're talking about, how racism was used to justify. Racism developed as a justification for these capital accumulation enterprises, but that insight doesn't appear anywhere in what he's actually proposing as solutions, or it doesn't appear in his public-facing persona. It's all about how can we have institutions meet racial quotas, and it's it's just so frustrating. But anyway, back to Peter Thiel.
Yeah, I know. I could go on for a long time about those guys, and he's maybe one of the worst ones. And he's a real lightweight. He won't debate anyone or anything. He's basically he's like a DEI higher philosopher or something. I don't know how else to say.
Did his center recently? There was uncovering some there was some reporting about that center of anti-racism or something, and about how useless
yeah.
it was, about how like it was kind of a grift.
Got tons
I
of
might be
money.
confusing that with another similar liberal entity.
No,
but
I think you're not. I think that there are other ones like that. So I think both the Alicia Garza Black Lives Matter thing,
that too,
and his anti-racism thing, that those were both like basically rackets that brought in a ton of money, but then did not have a lot to show for them and did not do much in the grassroots to change much of anything. So I would say it doesn't have to be either or. It's both of those two organizations especially were like that. But Thiel says here, I only have a couple paragraphs to bring out here because it's like the thing is kind of weird and incoherent. It's worth reading just to think like, what is this guy saying? But he writes, in 2016, President Barack Obama told his staff that Trump's victory was not the apocalypse. By any definition, he was correct, but understood in the original sense of the Greek word apocalypsis, meaning unveiling. Obama could not give the same reassurance in 2025. Trump's return to the White House augurs the apocalypsis of the ancien regime's secret. It's like French for like old regime, basically. You hear it in political science, political theory discussions. The new administration's revelations need not justify vengeance. Reconstruction can go hand in hand with reconciliation. But for reconciliation to take place, there must first be truth. Okay, and then the other paragraph I want to read from this. It may be too early to answer the internet's questions about the late Mr. Epstein, but one cannot say the same. Also, why is he saying this?
Yeah.
It's too early to answer the questions about Epstein? Okay. But one cannot say the same about the assassination of John F. Kennedy. 65% of Americans still doubt that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. Like an outlandishly postmodern detective story, we have waited 61 years for a denouement, while the suspects Castro, 60s mafiosi, the CIA's Alan Dulles gradually die. The thousands of classified government files on Oswald may or may not be red herrings, but opening them up for public inspection will give America some closure. So he also talks about the need to like examine things like COVID and Russiagate, which apparently aren't too recent. But this part about Mr. Epstein is very dubious when he says it may be too early to answer the internet's questions about the late Epstein. Well, pretty much every person that I consider, a sober analyst of these things believes that the most likely explanation of Epstein is that he was Mossad with CIA sanction, like he belonged to intelligence.
I've actually never encountered anyone who doesn't believe that, who doesn't accept that on some level Epstein was intelligence connected. There are a lot of people who can't take that to its logical conclusion, but it seems that a lot of this is trying to muddy the waters about things by saying like, okay, we can't answer stuff about Epstein, but we can talk about the Kennedy assassination, granddaddy of all things. But then like Russiagate and COVID, much like mentioning the 1619 thing, it's trying to signal to a very specific audience, a very specific version of conspiracism that doesn't necessarily intersect with capital. I mean, if we're talking about the CIA's role in JFK, in any serious way, it's talking about the CIA as an extension of America's oligarchy, reach down and intervene in democracy. And if that's the case, then Peter Thiel himself would be suspect because he's a creature of those same transit forces. But if it's just like, it could have been Castro, could have been the mafia, could have been the CIA, maybe, then it's not a story about American capitalism and American empire. It's a story of random crazy things happening that we need to get to the bottom of.
Yes. Well, let's look at, and I think this will be the last thing that we talk about today, and this is the JFK case, which has been talked about more and more recently. Alex Jones posted you can see the graphic that they made for it. New JFK assassination tape drops. Okay, and Jefferson Morley, our friend, did a good write-up for it over at JFK Facts. That's his Substack, which you should check out if you have interest in the case. That's one of the best, very best sites for it. Between him and Jim D'Eugenio, they're like the most dogged people covering things in the case. So I do recommend Jeff Morley's JFK Facts. The article was culpable sensationalist Alex Jones and his JFK tape. I think he says culpable because he was found guilty of libel and slander and such related to Sandy Hook. So I think that's what he means here. So, excuse me. The tape that they aired originated with Shane Stevens, grandson of Billy Sol Estes, a lobbyist close to Johnson. On Jones' January 14 InfoWars livestream, Stevens candidly described his grandfather as a notorious figure in a Texas mafia which specializes in politics, pay-for-play, and even murder. Estes indeed epitomized the corruption of Congress in the post-war era, and it has long been rumored in the world of JFK researchers that he made tapes concerning Kennedy's assassination. On the tape, recorded sometime in 1971, Stevens says, it's according to Stevens, it was recorded in 1971. A voice attributed to Estes tells a voice attributed to Cliff Carter, former top official of the Democratic National Committee, that LBJ hired a man named Mac Wallace to assassinate JFK. So, have you been following the story at all, Bryce, or?
No, because I only saw it while I was scrolling Twitter. I saw that Alex Jones had posted something about JFK tapes. And, I tend to ignore most things from Alex Jones. I'm not someone who will fully dismiss something because it comes from Alex Jones, but certainly him being the voice for this doesn't encourage me to look into it further. Because, who knows what it could be. But, if Jeff Morley's looking into it, well, that's a name I respect. That's a person whose work I can respect. So, I'm interested in hearing what he has to say about it.
Yeah, I think that I'm wary of it because, especially for personal reasons, like I've encountered people trying to say that LBJ did it recently. When I was working with Ford Trying, I had big arguments with John Kirby about that, saying like, you don't want to say this. This is kind of a disinformation thing. You want to pin it on this one guy. That's a way to let capitalism and imperialism and the American system as a whole off the hook. And it's too convenient. It's like the way that the plotters did this, there are multiple potential false sponsors that they've tried to, at some points they tried to blame Cuba. So people like Frank Sturgis, the future Watergate burglar, he was involved in activities immediately after the assassination that were going to frame Oswald as a Castro agent. Oswald himself, by pretending to be such a Cuba supporter, and a part of the Fair Play for Cuba committee, right? But he's really working out of the office of this basically guy who's even deeper and darker than the FBI. Like he's privatized, but he's ex-FBI, but he's working with all these super right-wing fascist groups and Cuban exiles, helping to prepare for like operations against Cuba and so on. So like Oswald even was trying to create an illusion that he was a pro-Castro communist. Jack Ruby at one point blames LBJ. He says that, why were you in this position? Who's really behind the assassination? And then he says something to the effect of, well, we wouldn't be here if Adlai Stevenson had been vice president, something to that effect, right? So he's basically Jack Ruby himself, a conspirator to the assassination plot on some level, says that it's LBJ. So this is to me very dubious, and it points to, in conjunction with the Peter Thiel thing, and then the fact that you have RFK Jr. and Trump, who are both such super ultra Zionists, really, and they're talking about the JFK case, it makes me wary of how they might do anything to attempt to gain power over the intelligence community and so on by revealing some aspect of their darkest secrets. So, and I had written in the past, which is why it's funny for Thiel to be talking about truth and reconciliation, because that's a concept I've supported. And in American Exception, when I say how this empire might be unwound without nuclear doomsday, one of the things I say is revelations of, spectacular crimes. Now, I always figured that these would be a way to say that, like, it was the regime that did this, it was these actors in the CIA or the Joint Chiefs or whatever, and they shouldn't have done that, and it was bad, and that they would never really trace it back to the oligarchs who did it. Like, I wasn't really expecting any sort of real full-on revelation about everything, but if you revealed some of these things, enough of the truth, then you might get something, a basis for some serious reforms. But with people like Trump and RFK, and then I think about the fact that the Israel lobby and other aspects that are tangentially, a degree or two separate from, if not, less than that, connected to Israel and Zionism, that like basically pro-Israel people have been behind, and people connected to the Hafez Teamsters and such, which I see as being tied to Lansky and to Mossad, really, that they've been responsible for some of the like Kennedy truth JFK Truth initiatives, really. I mean, Jim Garrison has strange links to the guy that told Jim Garrison to investigate it, the assassination. Senator Long was a guy who'd also been trying to get Hoffa out of jail. He was connected to the Teamsters. The ditto for the guy that ran the committee to investigate assassinations, which helped to get the House Select Committee for Assassinations created. This guy named Bernard Fensterwald, and he was connected to a senator who was also trying to get Hoffa out. You know, Hoffa and Lansky both worked on like Cuba, anti-Cuba operations. The Teamsters pension funds went to Las Vegas casinos to build them, and then those turned into huge money laundering operations for Lansky's, you know, global drug trafficking operations. And Lansky himself was one of the people who helped to fund Israel, you know, and set up those companies to get them arms so that they could create the state of Israel. Like it's very strange that this is where we're hearing JFK Truth talk from people who are connected to the Israel lobby, when the Israel lobby and Israel and Zionist forces have been kind of using the JFK assassination in different weird ways over the years to apparently put pressure on the U.S. establishment. Like, for example, Oliver Stone's movie being financed by a guy who is indisputably an Israeli spook, or the financing was secured by it. Well, only years later, though, did this come out. But so to me, I'm very wary of this, and I hope that it gets us towards the truth. But when I see things like Alex Jones doing this LBJ thing, I feel that we're just going to get a new mythical deception from if we get anything.
I think you and I were talking maybe a year or two ago about why it was that Tucker Carlson was someone who was speaking a lot of truth about the Kennedy assassination. I think it was on the anniversary back in 23 or something. And one of the things that I speculated about, and I still hold to, and this reinforces, is this idea of the next decade or so having a controlled American glasnost period. A period where the pressure cooker has been, there's too much pressure from the general public, too much distrust in our narratives, too much skepticism of official stories. That something's got to give, that big revelations have to be acknowledged. But they will be done so in a way that directs attention away from the actual inner workings of the regime and misdirects criticisms of our current situation. And so I was thinking that figures like Tucker Carlson, CIA, his dad ran Voice of America, one of the most popular commentators in America, could be a major figure in that. The RFK Jr. campaign, his talk about the Kennedy assassinations, his uncle and father, while valid sometimes, could also be part of that because, he does seem to be an Israeli asset to a great degree. And also you have people like Tulsi Gabbard, who is her Wikipedia page describes her accurately as a psychological warfare officer. And she was going around carrying JFK and the unspeakable in her arm. And
I think somebody handed it to her like a supporter. So
well, no, it's because then someone
read it, but
because then someone went and asked her about it, like publicly, and said, "Oh, I saw you had JFK and the Unspeakable," and she was like, "Oh yeah, I really like this book." And he was like, "You have any thoughts on it?" And she was like, I really like this book. Yeah. And so it just seems like she's signaling to this same crowd of people who are skeptical of official narratives. I said,
damning book, man. That book is not really the limited hangout book. That to me.
Yeah, exactly. Like you can't read that.
That book is not saying like it's a couple bad apples or it was Castro or LBJ. It's basically saying like it's the pinnacle of our society as this darkness, this dark void at the top.
Right, and I can't imagine like a politician reading that, taking it seriously, and then behaving in the way that she does, at least, or not having anything substantive to say about it when asked in public. But Alex Jones, another major intelligence-connected figure, long time been a rabble rouser.
Presumably, I don't know that there's any sort of what you'd call proof for it, but I feel the same way. I have to guess he's a plant because it's too perfect what he does.
Yeah, I mean, occasionally he talks about having like sources in the intelligence community, so that to me like indicates that if people are talking to him like that, then like he's being used for something. And if that's true, I mean, like he's part of this, like we have now, this controlled American glasnost, where these secrets or these acknowledgments of past official lies are being used to channel energy and emotion into backing a new project that may not actually be in the people's interest. And so I think that that's what's happening, and I expect over the next decade or so to see more and more mainstream discussion about the Kennedy assassination. Maybe by the end of the 2020s, maybe we're going to have a big 60-minute segment on, oh well, what did the Saudis have to do with 9/11? What didn't we know then? Like things like that legitimize critique of old official narratives, but don't point the finger at the systemic lawlessness and the systemic, empire making at the heart of it. So that's what I'm worried about. That this stuff will be like scapegoating Johnson, but even the acknowledgement of an official lie will be used to enhance the credibility of people who are trying to mislead us.
Yeah, I feel that they may not have. Here's an optimistic possibility, because I say it in the book that it would actually be in the national interest for these oligarchs to and the U.S. system as a whole to unveil these things, because the U.S. empire has failed. This project of global dominance has really failed, and there's no way to really get it back without a nuclear war, which would be failing also. It would just be, how is the U.S. global dominance project going to fail? Is it going to collapse spectacularly, through losing a bunch of wars or financial crisis? Or is it going to collapse because it starts a nuclear war that ends the world? Or can it be reformed in some way? Will people step back from the brink, realizing that the future lies with international cooperation and peace and international lawfulness, an end to regime change and economic warfare and everything else? So that's the question: is how is the U.S. empire going to end? And perhaps an optimistic reading would be that some of these things have gained more prominence in recent years as a kind of contingency plan in case things do continue to fail, and that there would be a way to pivot into a period of reformation. That's the most optimistic thing that some people, and I'm not talking about Peter Thiel as being a part of that, but maybe him writing about that is in some way him articulating something that's in the wind in one way or another, in some way that I can't articulate or I'm not really privy to. Because it actually does make sense. I mean, the oligarchs will not benefit from nuclear war, and there's going to need to be some sort of change to reform things. And maybe that would be one way to do it. But I don't necessarily think they're at that stage yet. But what does shock me in recent years is that they are not able to game out how things are going to happen. I mean, the Iraq War, for example, the 21st century has been full of insane adventures, misadventures, catastrophes. The Afghanistan war was stupid from the beginning to try to go about it that way. They didn't really need to depose the Taliban. The Taliban weren't really instrumental in the attack. It didn't make us any safer to occupy Afghanistan, but we did corner the market on opium production, or at least our subsidiaries in the underworld did. And all that money goes into the financial system, so we probably had some benefit from that. But the Iraq War was a disaster that didn't go as they said it would. Libya was a disaster, although they might be happy just to have gotten rid of that regime and that government that was for African liberation, basically. And the Ukraine situation is the biggest own goal I can imagine for an empire. They basically forced an undefeatable foe, which Russia really was in this context, into a corner. I mean, Obama said it perfectly. They have escalatory advantage, so I don't want to give them more weapons. We don't want a war in Ukraine because Russia has escalatory advantage. They're right there. It's right there in their backyard. And they see it as an existential threat, meaning that they will, whatever force is put into there to threaten them with a weaponized Ukraine, Russia will be compelled to counter it all the way up. And so how high does Russia go? Well, Russia can go as high as blowing up the whole world as well. So and they should have been able to game that out before they ever did it, but they don't. So this is where they may not know what they're doing, and these things may represent some kind of contingency plan by some people who realize that perhaps reform is in the offing. That's the most optimistic take that I can offer.
Well, let's hope that you're right about that. And there are people trying to guide this massive, crazy plane onto a soft landing, or as soft as possible.
Yeah, because I think I'm hoping 2025 is just not the year that the whole thing goes kaboom, the whole world.
Yeah, I mean, just in the last, so much crazy stuff has happened since like Election Day that it looks like we're in a trajectory for more crazy shit happening.
Yeah, for
the foreseeable future. So.
Well, I'm glad that you're out there and that you and I are doing our best to try to keep our heads. And until next time, Bryce, thanks so much for joining us.
All right. Happy to be here. Until next time, Aaron.
Thanks to Dana Chavarria for producing this episode, and thank you for tuning in. Let's hope that we survive 2025. As grim as this all is, I do hope that Churchill's observation proves to be correct. He said, "The Americans can always be counted on to do the right thing, but only once they've exhausted all of their options. Right now, the right thing for the U.S. to do is to give up the imperial ghost. We should stop going for global dominance and start looking to partner with other countries so that we can solve the huge but solvable problems facing humanity. In other words, it's time for Uncle Sam to walk away from the devil's chessboard."